CQ, CQ, CQ. This is Kilo 5 Charlie Lima Mike, and you are listening to the Everything Ham Radio podcast. Hey everybody, and welcome back to the Everything Ham Radio podcast. Whether you're listening to this podcast or whether you're reading my blog, I really hope that you're enjoying it. This episode is going to be the starting point of our general topic for this quarter. Last quarter we talked about digital communications and emergency communications. They kind of go hand in hand to a certain degree. This quarter and up until probably around field day, we're going to be talking about HF. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about, just to kind of give you all a preview a little bit, we're going to be covering things like DXing, contesting, awards, special event stations, SOTA, which is Summits on the Air, NPOTA, the National Parks on the Air, and eventually around mid-June we're going to talk about field day, emergency power, and portable setups. So a lot of exciting topics coming up over the next couple months or so, leading up to field day, which is hopefully going to be pretty exciting this year. And actually I hope I'm going to be able to actually participate at least a little bit in it. I work on weekends, so I normally don't get a chance to, but I'm going to try to this year. So really, a little side note here, okay? I've been a ham now for 20 years, and I'm sure you've heard me say this before, but it amazes me every time that I research a topic or something like that, just what I learn. I've never really done a whole lot on HF because of one reason or another, whether it's because I didn't have an HF radio, or whether I lost my ham shack because I needed another bedroom for the kids or whatever. But as I'm doing research on HF and on some of the other things, it really kind of reignites my fire a little bit for the hobby. And I'm hoping more in the close future rather than the distant future to actually have my ham shack set back up. And now that I have my tower down at my old house, I'm trying to figure out where to put it at the new house, and then eventually maybe get my station back up. But anyways, that is a little off topic, like I said, but hopefully I can get a station back up and get back on HF, because I'm really excited to do some of this stuff that we're going to be talking about over the next few months. So anyways, let's go ahead and dive into the topic of today. Okay, so on to HF. HF is a portion of the radio spectrum that amateur radio operators have access to according to the FCC and the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union. In the U.S., the frequency allocations for amateur radios is coordinated by the FCC Rules and Regulations, more specifically Part 97. And these allocations are different and according to where you are in the world. There are 3 regions for the ITU, which North America or the U.S. is part of Region 2. So those 3 regions, Region 1 is Europe, Russia, Africa, the Middle East. Region 2 is North and South America and Greenland. And Region 3 is Australia, Indonesia, Japan, New Zealand, South Pacific, and Asia south of Siberia. So those are the 3 main regions. Not all of the frequencies are going to be the same in each region. A lot of them are, but not all of them. So once every 4 to 6 years, I believe it is, there is a meeting, I guess, of all the regions where delegates from each region or from each country or whatever are sent to discuss topics, and among other things are frequency allocations. They might talk about rules or MOUs or other things along those natures. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about frequencies. Now, these are, like I said, the majority may be the same, may not be the same, but these are what it is in the US. So as a amateur extra, you can talk on 80 meters, and that's from 3.5 to 4 megahertz. 80 meters is best at night. In significant daylight, the signal tends to be absorbed. So like in summer times, you're going to get a lot of noise, you're going to not get as far. So it really works best in the winter when there's less sunlight. Normally, this band is limited to, it looks like around maybe ITU region 2. Only the countries in the Americas and a few others have access to this band. In other areas, they don't have access to it at all, or very little. This also kind of corresponds with 75 meters. So 80, 75 meters are pretty much the same. They're just slightly different. 60 meters, it's a 5 megahertz region, and it's a relatively new allocation. And again, only a small number of countries have access to it, such as the US, United Kingdom, Ireland, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland. They are continuing to expand into more countries having access to it, but it's not very much. Next on the list of bands that an extra has access to is 40 meters. 40 meters is one of the major bands. I think probably would be the best way to describe it. 40 meters is from 7 to 7.3 megahertz. It is the most reliable all-season DX band. It's very popular at night for DX. It's reliable for medium distance during the day, say like 1,500 kilometers, whatever that is in miles. I'm not sure off the top of my head. But 1,500 kilometers is about what it's going to reach. And 30 meters is our next on our list, and that goes from 10.1 to 10.15. It's a very narrow band, and it's shared with a non-amateur service, so we are second. And I think, if memory serves me correct, it's basically just for Morse code data. I think there is a little bit of voice in there, but not a whole lot, so it's really recommended to use something that's a narrow usage like Morse code or data. Okay, next on the list is 20 meters. 20 meters is another one of the big bands of the U.S. Playing field, so to speak. It is from 1400 to 14.35 megahertz, or 14 to 14.35 megahertz. It's probably the most popular DX band. It's usually most popular during the daytime. It is used a lot for like emergency nets. A lot of times they'll use 20 meters during the day and 40 meters at night, or like 40 meters during the day and 80 meters at night, something like that. So it's, like I said, it's really popular. Some of the smaller bands, 17 meters is from 18.068 to 18.168. It is similar to 20 meters as far as propagation goes, like that, but it's more sensitive to solar propagation. 15 meters from 21 to 21.45 megahertz is normally the best during maximum solar output, and generally during the daytime. When daytime sporadic propagation occurs, very occasionally on this band, then you can get a pretty good skip. 12 meters from 24.89 to 24.99 megahertz. Again, mostly used during the day, but occasionally you will get some good DX at night when you got a lot of solar activity. This is also a relatively new band for use. I don't know what this is. In my notes here I have 12 meters is one of the new WARC bands. I'm not sure what WARC is. Shame on me. Last but not least, on the HF spectrum, we have 10 meters. 10 meters is like your entry band. It runs from 28 to 29.7. Is just slightly higher than Citizens band here in the U.S. And actually, I think the top 3 or 4 channels of CB overlaps into 10 meters, if I'm not mistaken. It does really good when there is a whole lot of solar activity. Not so much other times. It's very kind of wishy-washy, maybe, unless the solar activity is big. 10 meters is really good during the peak of the solar cycle. A little side note here, okay? Back when the Olympics were in Australia, I want to say about 15-20 years ago or so, they had a special events station set up, and my amateur radio club had a club camp out during one of the weekends, and we actually hopped onto HF. We had a little station that we set up, and we hopped onto HF and 10 meters, and actually were able to talk to the special event station on 10 meters in Australia. So that was really cool. I really got a kick out of that. So, as I was saying before, 10 meters is very solar oriented. When with the solar cycle, I believe it's every 10 years, maybe 12 years or something like that. I may be wrong. If you know for sure, if you use 10 meters a lot more, leave a comment in the notes. everythinghamradio.com/podcast/14. That's 14. Leave a comment there and let me know for sure. I believe it's every 10 years, but at the peak of the solar cycle is when 10 meters really gets kicking. So, next thing we're going to talk about is propagation. In the previous podcast, we've been dealing a lot with VHF and UHF and not so much with HF. Well, as we've talked about before, VHF and above is basically line of sight. You have your repeaters that will extend your range, but either way, it's still line of sight. A line of sight from the repeater, line of sight from your person, whichever. HF is a little different. HF uses what is called skywave propagation. So skywave propagation is basically where your signal is transmitted out and it bounces off some layer of the ionosphere. With VHF and above, the frequency is high, and the reflective index or refractive index is high enough where it won't bounce back. It just continues out straight into space. So with HF, we get the extended range because they're bouncing back. So basically what it'll do is it'll take from your 20 meters or your 40 meters or whatever, and it'll go up to the upper layers of the ionosphere, the E region or the F region, or if you're during the day, the F region actually splits in two and becomes an F1 and F2 region, and then back at night they combine back together. How scientists know that is just is beyond me, but yeah, that's going to take somebody smarter than me to explain why that happens. But anyways, so if you're talking on 20 meters, and especially like I believe 20 meters was most accessible for, maybe it's 40, one of the two. But anyways, during the daytime, you send your call sign out, and it bounces off the F1 or F2 region and bounces back to Earth. Well, because you're not limited to line of sight, and it's going way up, like 10 miles or something like that up to the F region and bouncing back, then that extends your coverage like a couple hundred-fold. As I talked about a little bit earlier, we actually talked to Australia during the Olympic Games, and we were in Texas. So, that's basically on the other side of the Earth. How that happened, that's like, wow. I'm sure there's probably, maybe a good skip, maybe some tropospheric ducting, something. Again, I don't know how it worked, but it actually did, and it was really cool. I wish we would have got a QSL card for that contact, but unfortunately we didn't. So, anyways, with VHF, you're going to get a lot more range than VHF and UHF. You're going to have, it's going to bounce off the atmosphere, so atmospheric conditions are going to come into play. Your solar storms or your solar flares are going to affect what range you get, who you can hear, and many other things. There's other things that come into play on how far you talk. Like I mentioned tropospheric ducting a minute ago. Basically, that's like your radio signal enters an area above water normally, and the signal doesn't degrade, but it continues on for until it reaches land again. So if conditions are right and you're near the coast, you can enter this tropospheric ducting. That's real easy for me to say. Anyways, you enter this area of tropospheric ducting, and you may go clear across the Atlantic to Europe, or to across the Pacific to Australia or whatever. That's probably what happened to us back in the during the Olympics there in Australia. Even though we were in Texas, maybe that's what happened. Maybe it didn't. Okay, so next, we talked a little bit ago about how the F1 region, the F2 region combined to just make the F layer of the ionosphere. Now, I think I mentioned this before, but I'm going to say this again. You get, during the day when you have the F1, the F2 region, or layers of the ionosphere, you're going to have further travel. You're going to have a bigger skip than you would otherwise. But at night, when the F1 and the F2 layers combine just to form the F layer, you might not have as good distance or signal quality. So a lot of times, if you've ever participated in an HF net, especially on things like the Hurricane Watch net, which is down along the like Florida to Texas coast, along the Gulf Coast, and along the eastern seaboard, this net will activate whenever a storm is within 300 statute miles of land and moving towards the land. It automatically activates, and it's kind of like a long-term Skywarn net, I guess, maybe. But anyways, it's on HF, and people are encouraged to give reports on wind speed and stuff like that they're getting, rain and stuff like that. And so during the day when this is going on, it's on 20 meters. And if they can continue to use 20 meters, great. If not, then they have a backup frequency on 40 meters that's picked out, so you can maintain communications. And this is also true on things like here in Texas. Our state emergency management office has I believe it's a 40 meter frequency that they use to speak with all the EOCs in the state of Texas. And then during night, when it doesn't talk as well, they go to 80 meters. And I may have that backwards, but I believe that's the way it is. So, different bands have different characteristics, reach different amount of people, work better in different times. So that's stuff you're just going to have to kind of work with a little bit, I think, to understand your area, your propagation, your antenna, basically your station. Okay, so the last thing that we're going to talk about on this episode is modes. Now, when we've talked about VHF and UHF, we're predominantly talking about HF or FM mode, frequency modulation, because that's the majority of what 2 meters and above is, or actually 6 meters and above is FM. In HF, it's a little different because HF is an AM mode, or amplitude modulation. And with amplitude modulation, you have a carrier wave on the frequency that you're listening to. Say you're listening to 14.1 or something like that. There is a carrier wave that's on that frequency, but then your radio will, nowadays not so much, but when this was first discovered, it was discovered that you have two sidebands to this frequency, and they're like 2.5 kilohertz apart, I believe is what it is. Excuse me there, guys. I had a yawn. I have a case of the yawns today. I don't know why. But anyways, you have a sideband on the left, a lower sideband, and a sideband on the right of the frequency, an upper sideband. And the information that's encoded on this is basically a mirror image of each other. So back, I think it was like 50 years ago or something, and AM was really big. They were using both sidebands, and they were mirror images of each other, and it was discovered that you could cut off one of the sidebands and have better quality and get better distance, and was just basically overall better. Now, you have to maintain the carrier frequency, the carrier wave, in order to decode the sideband of it. So they couldn't get rid of the sideband, but they could get rid of one of the sidebands. So, long story short, as technology increased and knowledge increased about radio transmissions, it was determined that you could talk on just one sideband, either upper or lower sideband, have your carrier wave, and you would have better quality, better distance, better sounds, all that good stuff. So, if you remember back a couple episodes ago, I believe we talked about the International International Telecommunications Union, the ITU. Yeah. They basically got together. One of the things that they talked about was which sideband to use. And I may be wrong, that may not be the ITU that did this, but it was agreed by pretty much everybody in the world on which sideband to use and what band. And normally it's fairly easy to remember. So basically it's lower sideband on 160 meters through 75 meters. And then upper sideband on 60 meters, which is the relatively new band that we have. And back to lower sideband on 40 meters. Well, before we got the 60 meters, it was from 40 meters up, it was lower sideband, and from 40 meters, or below 40 meters was upper sideband. So now that we have the 60 meters, they threw a monkey wrench in there. But anyways, lower sideband 160 meters through 75, upper sideband on 60, lower sideband on 40, and then all bands above 40 meters uses the upper sideband. So your 30 meters, 15, 20, 17, 12, and 10 all use upper sideband. 40, 80, 40, 75, 80, 160 use lower sideband. So if you don't use the right sideband on the right mode, people are not going to be able to hear you as good. It's going to have a very tinny or muffly sound to it. They still might catch you, they might not. Depends on what their radio is hearing. But so always make sure that you're talking on the right sideband. So I believe that about wraps it up for this episode. We're going to move on now to the Amateur Radio Club Spotlight. Okay, so the Amateur Radio Club Spotlight for this week is on the Voice of Idaho Amateur Radio Club. You can locate their website at www.voiceofidaho.org. This club is, of course, in Idaho. It looks like a fairly large group. They have meetings on the second Wednesday of the month, except for in August, at 7 p.m. at the Idaho Pizza Company at 405 East Fairview Road in Meridian, Idaho. Pizza. That sounds really good. I might have to have that for lunch. Sorry about that, guys. They have two nets. They have a general purpose net that meets on Thursday evenings at 8 p.m. and all of their analog repeaters are linked together. And they also have a over-the-hill commute group net, and that goes every weekday starting at 7:10 a.m. and that is located on the 147.240 repeater. Speaking of repeaters, they actually have quite a few. They actually have 5 analog repeaters and 3 D-Star repeaters that are owned by their club. I'm going to go through them real fast here. You can find all this information in the show notes of this episode. Okay, so the repeaters, 147.240, it is on Cinnabar Mountain, and the 443.60 repeater is also on Cinnabar Mountain. Both those repeaters are solar powered, so if there's a lot of cloud cover or whatever, they might go off the air. They have a 146.840 repeater, and that's at Schaefer Butte, I believe. They also had, at the time of this recording, they had or have a repeater 444.60 that is also at Schaefer Butte. At the time of this recording, it's out of service. Whether or not they bring it back up or not, I don't know. This is what it says on their website. So they have a 146.62 repeater on Snowbank Mountain and a 145.29 repeater in Treasure Valley. Their D-Star repeaters are 145.5 in Treasure Valley and 443.350 also in Treasure Valley. Then they have a one lonely D-Star repeater out in Jerome, which is 444.80. So check them out, connect to the D-Star repeaters, maybe give somebody a shout out there that in that area, and tell them you heard of their club and their repeaters on the Everything Ham Radio podcast. They also have 2 APRS digipeaters. One of them is on Cinnabar Mountain, and the other is on Snowbank Mountain. I'm sure probably in the same building as their antennas. Both of the APRS digipeaters are solar powered as well. So, again, if it's cloudy, they may go offline. Let's see, testing sessions. They give a testing session on the first Saturday of every month at the Food 2 store at 3055 Fairview Avenue, number 130 in Meridian, Idaho. Now, the reason that I picked this club for this episode was basically because this club sponsors the Idaho State Convention, which is coming up this weekend, April 22nd through 24th, 2016. The convention will be at the Wyndham Garden Hotel at 3300 South Vista Avenue in Boise, Idaho. So if you're going to be in the Boise, Idaho area this weekend, head on over there. The tickets for the 3 days are $10 a piece. They have food that you can buy there. They have like a banquet. They have lots of speakers. I'm sure there'll be a lot of vendors, commercial and otherwise there. So check that out if you're going to be in the Idaho area. It's definitely worth going to, I'm sure. So I guess that about wraps it up for this episode. So I really want to thank everybody for listening. Again, you can find the show notes for this episode at everythinghamradio.com/podcast/14. That's 14. The number is 14. You can find links to this club, the Idaho State Convention, as well as anything that I mentioned in this episode. You can find links in the show notes there. If you have any questions or comments that you would like to give me about this episode or any other episode, please leave them in the comments below in the show notes. And I look forward to this quarter's topics. We are going to have quite a few interesting ones, I'm sure. And again, this all leads up to Field Day in June. So please continue to listen and continue to like, share, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. So until next time, this is Kilo 5 Charlie Lima Mike and 73. Hey everybody, once again I'd like to say thank you for listening to this episode of the Everything Ham Radio podcast. If you like what you heard here, head on over to our website. There's lots of information there that I'm sure you're going to love. You can find it at everythinghamradio.com. While you're there, subscribe to get emails on when I publish a new post or a new podcast. You can click on the subscribe button at the top of the page or go there directly at everythinghamradio.com/subscribe. Also, like me on Facebook at facebook.com/everythinghamradio and follow me on Twitter at K5CLM. Also, I would greatly appreciate it if you would subscribe to this podcast, like it, share it with your friends, help me spread the word. So until next time, 73.